The first scream didn't come from the man who was shot. It came from the man who fired, when he realized the bullet had done what bullets do, and the target simply refused to behave like a target. We were on a strip of wet land between reeds and river, dawn still half asleep, fog dragging its belly across the water. The prisoner stood with his hands loose, almost polite, as if he had agreed to die just to be cooperative. My escort, a young Cossack with eyes too bright for peace, nodded to the musketeer. A crack split the air. The prisoner's body jerked. Yes, it did. Flesh is flesh. But he did not fall. He did not even step back. He only blinked once, slowly, and then looked at the shooter as if disappointed by the man's lack of imagination. The musketeer lowered his weapon without meaning to. His lips moved in a prayer he hadn't spoken since childhood. The prisoner smiled. Not triumphant, not mocking, a tired smile, like a physician watching a patient deny a fever. "You should aim at my fear," the prisoner said, in a voice so calm it felt indecent, "not at my chest." That's when someone behind me whispered the word I had heard only in rumors, always at night, always with a glance over the shoulder. Kharakternyky, a man with character, a man with a will so hard it could bend the world, or, in older tongues, a witch, a corrupter, a devil's clerk. The word had once been spat like poison. Now it was spoken like a shield. And I, Semen, the Sich's reluctant scribe, a man trained to write inventories and prayers, felt something colder than fog slide into my ribs. If these men existed, then war was not what I thought it was. It was worse. It was mind against mind. The Zaporizhian Sich was not a city so much as a living mechanism built from hunger, laughter, discipline, and fury. It breathed with the river, ate with the seasons, and slept with a knife under its pillow. Man arrived here carrying different wounds. Some carried scars, some carried guilt, some carried only ambition. They thought the Sich would give them a new name. It did sometimes. But the Kharakternyky, if they were real, offered something stranger. They took your name away and replaced it with a function. That was the first thing you learned if you were allowed close enough to learn at all. They were not a unit you could count, not a banner you could point at, no parade, no boasting, no loud songs dedicated to them. They existed the way a blade exists in a sleeve, unseen until needed. I heard the stories like everyone else, that a Kharakternyky could walk through a storm and stay dry, that he could turn into a wolf and run beside horses without tiring, that he could heal a man with a whisper or kill a man with a look, that bullets avoided them, that enemies, Tatars, Turks, Poles, sometimes fled before a battle even began because they had already heard what happens when you fight men who do not fear dying. As a scribe, I dismissed these tales the way educated men dismiss folklore, politely, with secret relief. Superstition is comforting. It means the world is irrational and therefore not your responsibility. Then I watched the prisoner on the riverbank look at a musket like it was a child's toy, and I stopped dismissing.
If you want to build an elite corps, you don't start with weapons. You start with a nervous system. The Kharakternyky recruited without announcements. Their method was not a call, it was a sieve. The Sich was full of loud courage, cheap courage, drunken courage. They didn't want that. They wanted men whose courage came from something deeper than adrenaline. The first filter was silence. A Kharakternyky, often an older man who looked like nobody special, would sit near fires, near drills, near the places where new recruits tried too hard to impress. He would say little. He would watch everything. He watched who bragged the moment a story began, men who needed to be admired. He watched who laughed too loudly at another man's mistakes, men who hid fear behind cruelty. He watched who started fights for entertainment, men who mistook chaos for strength. And he watched who endured insult without reacting, not because they were weak, but because they could choose when to respond. Choice, not impulse, is the foundation of special operations. A man who cannot delay his anger cannot delay his noise. A man who cannot delay his noise cannot survive a night raid. The second filter was fatigue. A candidate might be tasked with hauling water at night after drills, or repairing boats at dawn after a feast, or standing guard in cold fog until his joints ached like old wood. This looked like punishment. It was diagnosis. Do you become sloppy? Do you start making excuses? Do you begin stealing time? Or do you shrink your world down to the next breath, the next step, the next task, and endure without drama? The third filter was loneliness. One evening I saw a young recruit sent away from the campfires with an icon and a knife. "Sit by the old mound," the elder told him. "Don't come back until sunrise." The recruit tried to laugh it off. He walked into the darkness with false swagger. But at night, the mind becomes its own enemy. Every reed turns into a hand. Every owl becomes a warning. The brain, starved for certainty, invents threats. Some recruits ran back before midnight, pale and furious, angry at being afraid. The Kharakternyky did not mock them. They simply stopped noticing them. But if a recruit stayed, trembling, praying, sweating, hearing wolves in the wind and still refusing to move, then the observers exchanged glances like merchants inspecting rare coin. The fourth filter, the final one, was the moral trap. A man who can endure fear is valuable. A man who can endure fear and still obey a code is priceless. Candidates were tested with temptations disguised as opportunities, a chance to steal from a comrade, a chance to betray a plan, a chance to humiliate a weaker man for status. If you took the bait, you failed. Not because the Kharakternyky were saints, they were not, but because a unit that works in shadows cannot survive internal rot. Betrayal is louder than gunfire. When the selection was done, there was no ceremony, no oath shouted into the sky. A candidate simply woke one morning to find a small thing placed near his sleeping roll, a braided cord, a carved mark, a strip of dark cloth, sometimes nothing but a stone scratched with a sign. It meant, "Tonight, come alone." That's how a myth recruits, quietly, personally, without witnesses.
Their life inside the circle was a paradox. They lived among the Cossacks, laughed at the same jokes, fought in the same mud, bled under the same sun. But there was a line around them you couldn't see until you tried to cross it. By day, they trained like disciplined warriors, riding, shooting, blade work, rowing, scouting, nothing unusual. By night, they became something else. I was allowed close only because scribes are useful to anyone who wants to be remembered and feared. The first rule I learned was this: a Kharakternyk is not allowed to be ruled by his appetite. Not drink, not lust, not pride, not rage. The Sich was famous for feasts and chaos. Whole barrels of courage were consumed nightly. But the Kharakternyky treated intoxication like a luxury you earned after work, not before. They understood that the mind is a blade. If you dull it, you die. The second rule: fasting is training. They fasted often, not for show, but to teach the body that discomfort is not an emergency. Hunger, cold, sleeplessness, these are the conditions of raids and sieges. A man who panics at hunger panics at war. The third rule: your brotherhood is your church. This did not replace faith. Many were deeply orthodox, icons, crossings, psalms. But the circle demanded loyalty as strict as any monastery. Betrayal, they said, was worse than death. Death ends you. Betrayal turns you into a weapon against your own. And the punishment for that wasn't always a knife. Sometimes it was something subtler and more terrifying. Being unmade. A man could be cast out without explanation. No one would speak his name. No one would trade with him. No one would share fire. In a warrior culture, that is execution by silence. Training, I learned, was where legend is forged. They trained the body, yes, endurance runs with gear through sand and reed, night swims across cold channels with knives clenched between teeth, rope climbs, falls, horse drills until thighs screamed. But the part that made them different was how they trained the mind. They treated fear like a muscle. Fear, when unmanaged, makes you noisy. It makes you twitch. It makes you breathe wrong. It makes you fumble flint and steel. So they taught breath as a weapon. A senior Kharakternyky, an older man with spars that looked like handwriting, would sit with recruits at night and teach a pattern. Inhale slow, hold, exhale slower, pause, repeat. Not mysticism, physiology. Slow breath calms the body's alarm system. Calm body lets the mind observe. Observation gives you options. Then they added focus drills that sounded like sorcery to outsiders. Stare into fire until the mind begins to drift, then pull it back, again and again. They said this trained the ability to resist panic, resist distraction, resist the brain's urge to flee into imagination. They practiced listening to silence, counting distant sounds, separating wind from hoofbeats, owl from human movement. They practiced moving in darkness without bumping anything, trusting toes and fingertips more than eyes. And they practiced the one skill that turned folklore into fear: suggestion. They learned how to speak to tired men, frightened men, superstitious men, how to plant an idea like a thorn, not by shouting, but by offering the mind a story it wants to believe. You hear wolves, you might whisper to a guard at midnight. Wolves don't come that close unless something is already dead. Or, did you see the fog move like that? Fog doesn't move against wind. Small phrases, but at night the brain multiplies them. Soon the guard is searching darkness for monsters that don't exist. Soon his hands shake. Soon his decisions become slow. And then a raid becomes easy. This is what people later called telepathy, knowing what the enemy will do. But it was not magic. It was pattern reading, sharpened by discipline. They also trained with ordinary weapons, made terrifying by mastery. Their kit was practical: a curved saber for fast cuts in close work, a pistol or two for sudden shock, a musket for open battle when needed, a knife, always, sometimes a short spear or axe, depending on mission. What frightened enemies was not the blade, it was the way the blade moved without hesitation. In battle, conscious thought is slow, reflex is fast. They drilled until reflex replaced deliberation. They drilled until fear had no time to speak. Rituals were the bridge between psyche and myth. They prayed, many sincerely. Before raids, they might kiss an icon, murmur a psalm, cross themselves. But alongside orthodoxy lived older step habits: knots tied in cords, herbs tucked into sleeves, whispered zamovolyannya taught by grandmothers, wormwood for clarity, St. John's wort for wounds, garlic for health, charms for courage. Were these magical? Some were medicine, some were superstition, some were psychological anchors, little physical reminders that the mind interprets as protection. A ritual is a switch. It tells the body, now we are entering a different state. That state, call it trance, call it focus, call it predatory calm, was their real sorcery. The initiation was not theatrical, it was cruel in a quiet way. When a man was accepted, he was brought to a place away from the Sich's noise, not a temple, not a cave, a simple patch of ground, wind cutting through reeds like knives. An elder placed 3 things before the candidate: an icon, a knife, a handful of earth. "Pick 2, he said. Most reached for knife and icon, steel and faith. Then the elder smeared the earth across their forehead anyway. "You don't get to avoid the 3rd, he said. "The land claims you whether you agree or not." The candidate was taught a breath pattern and a code phrase, half prayer, half signal, used to identify allies in darkness. Then he was left alone all night, sitting, listening, hungry, cold, with no task except endurance. Fear is not defeated in a duel, it is endured like weather. If the candidate lasted until sunrise, he returned not proud, but emptied. That emptiness was the point. An empty mind can be filled with discipline. The first mission I witnessed was not a battle, it was a disappearance. A Tatar patrol had been harassing the river routes, ambushing small boats, stealing supplies, leaving bodies as warnings. The Sich needed the patrol erased, but in a way that invited a larger retaliation. So the Kharakternyky did what they always did. They aimed at certainty. They studied the patrol for 2 nights, its habits, its arrogance. They learned where the sentries liked to stand, which men drank most, which horses spooked easily. They learned the rhythm of guard changes, the lazy gaps in discipline. On the 3rd night, they approached not as warriors, but as ghosts. They moved through reeds like water. No torches, no shouting, only the occasional click of flint covered by a cough. The patrol's campfire was small, sheltered. 2 guards watched the darkness with the bored confidence of men who have never paid for their mistakes. One of the guards stepped into view, alone, swaying as if drunk, speaking broken words, begging for water. The guards laughed, as humans always laugh when they think they are safe. One guard stepped forward. The drunk fell to his knees and whispered a something, a soft phrase, almost kind. The guard's face changed. Not fear, not anger, blankness. He nodded like a man accepting instruction, then turned back toward his comrades and waved them off, murmuring that it was nothing. That single heartbeat of trust was enough. Knives slid in from the sides. One guard's throat was cut so clean he never made a sound. Another was pinned before he could reach his bow. The fire was kicked out. Darkness swallowed screams. The patrol died not like heroes. It died like men who never understood they were already dead. And then the Kharakternyky did something that chilled me more than the killing. They arranged the camp afterward. They placed boots neatly by the extinguished fire. They hung a small charm from a branch. They left a strip of cloth tied in a knot that meant nothing to Tatars, except that it looked intentional. They wanted the next patrol to find it. They wanted rumor to spread. They wanted enemies to believe the steppe itself had teeth. That is psychological warfare. You don't just remove a threat, you plant fear of the unseen. In the Sich, stories traveled faster than boats. Soon traders spoke of patrols vanishing. Soon enemy scouts avoided certain reeds. Soon a superstition formed that the river had hungry men living inside its fog. And then came the name that always pulls legends toward it like iron to magnet: Ivan Sirko. Some called him a brilliant commander, some called him ruthless. Folklore called him something stranger, half man, half omen. Stories claimed he could outthink ambushes before they were laid, that he could ride into hopeless odds and come out laughing. Whether every tale is literal truth matters less than what the tales did. A leader becomes a fortress not only through strategy, but through belief. If your soldiers believe you cannot be killed, they fight harder around you. If your enemies believe it, they panic faster. Sirko's campaigns, raids into Crimea, sudden strikes and withdrawals, rescue of captives, disruption of supply lines, fed the myth engine. And within that engine, the Kharakternyky were the hidden gears. They weren't always the ones leading charges. They were the ones making the enemy's plan collapse before the first sword swung. They scouted paths that couldn't be crossed. They bribed, threatened, or tricked informants. They spread rumors intentionally. They set fires as signals. They turned geography into a weapon. And when the time came for a major raid, they did something so bold it sounded like shape-shifting. They became the enemy's nightmare. The famous raids, by sea in fast Chaiki, by land across reeds and steppe, were not won by heroism alone. They were won by speed, secrecy, and cruelty of calculation. A raid is not a duel, it is a theft. You steal time, you steal certainty, you steal the enemy's ability to respond. The Kharakternyky taught that a successful raid leaves the enemy asking the wrong questions. Not, how do we counter them, but how did they even get here? That question is poison. It erodes confidence.
During one coastal strike, a small Cossack force landed at night under a moon thin as a blade. The Kharakternyky went first, not with sabers, but with silence. They cut ropes on boats to prevent pursuit. They killed or bound sentries without screams. They moved like a disciplined animal, each man knowing where the others were without speaking. Outsiders later called this telepathy. It was planning, it was signals, it was shared rhythm. Once the port was struck, the Kharakternyky did not waste time fighting soldiers who could be replaced. They targeted what mattered: leadership, supplies, morale. They burned food stores, they released horses, they destroyed communication routes. They spread confusion by creating sounds from the wrong directions, whistles from behind walls, shouts from rooftops, drum beats from alleys. Men ran to defend nothing. Men died protecting empty streets. When dawn arrived, the raiders were already gone, vanishing as if the sea had swallowed them. And the surviving defenders did what frightened men always do. They explained the humiliation with magic. It wasn't men, they said. It was something else. The Kharakternyky allowed that belief to live, because belief is free ammunition. But the legend had a darker spine. You asked for the shocking truth, the harsh tricks that made enemies fear them. Here it is, without romantic perfume. They used terror carefully measured, not mindless cruelty, calculated fear. They struck at night because darkness multiplies uncertainty. They left survivors on purpose, not always, but often, because survivors carry stories farther than corpses. They staged impossible appearances, crossing marsh routes believed impassable, arriving from directions scouts swore were safe. Sometimes it was superior navigation, sometimes it was bribery, sometimes it was simply risk. But risk backed by calm looks like sorcery. They used deception that felt personal to the enemy, turning a sentry into a messenger, using captured uniforms, spreading false orders, mimicking voices in darkness. They understood that an army's true strength is not its numbers, but its coordination. Break coordination, and you break the army. In battle, they used feints with brutal efficiency. A small force might attack loud, draw defenders, then vanish.
pulling enemy units out of position. Then the main strike hit the exposed point. From the enemy's perspective, it felt like the Cossacks knew the plan. Again, telepathy. In reality, understanding that humans are predictable under pressure. A cornered commander does what cornered commanders do. A scared guard does what scared guards do. A proud officer does what proud officers do. The Kharakternyky didn't need supernatural powers. They needed human nature.
And yet, there were moments that didn't fit clean explanations. I saw a Kharakternyk treat a wounded man, feverish, delirious, by pressing 2 fingers to the patient's wrist and whispering a prayer that sounded like a lullaby. The man's breathing slowed, his panic faded, his eyes cleared. Later, the Kharakternyk told me quietly, "The body follows the breath. Calm the breath, you calm the storm." Medicine, psychology. But then, another night, during a retreat, I watched a Kharakternyk walk through a hail of musket fire as if the bullets were insects. Men around him fell. He did not. Was it luck? Angle? Distance? Smoke? The chaos of battle? Maybe. But the enemy didn't calculate maybes. They calculated doom. When one man appears untouched, 10 men begin to doubt their aim, then doubt their weapons, then doubt reality. Doubt is contagious, and when doubt spreads, discipline collapses. That's why the myth mattered. It wasn't decoration, it was strategy. The battle that sealed their legend for me happened near a river bend. Mud, reeds, fog thick enough to hide a horse. An enemy force, larger, better supplied, advanced with the confidence of numbers. Their commanders expected a straightforward clash. They expected Cossacks to charge, shout, and die loudly. Instead, the morning began with nothing. No banners, no drums, just fog and the slow creak of leather. Our line held in silence, which unsettled even our own men. Silence on a battlefield feels like a held breath. It makes the heart thump louder. Men want to fill it with noise, with bravado. The Kharakternyky moved through our ranks like priests, touching shoulders, murmuring short phrases, half blessing, half command. I saw men's faces change as if someone had tightened straps inside their chests. Then the enemy's front approached and stopped, because in the fog, something didn't look right. A shadow moved where no shadow should move. A horse snorted and shifted. A soldier swore. Someone laughed nervously. The enemy advanced again. And then the first shock hit, not steel, but confusion. From their left, they heard shouting as if attacked. They turned. There was nothing. From their rear, a horn sounded, a signal that was not theirs, but close enough to trigger instinct. Men pivoted, colliding with each other. Officers shouted contradictory orders. The Kharakternyky had done it. They had turned the fog into a weapon. In that confusion, our flanks struck hard and fast, sabers flashing briefly, pistols fired at close range to maximize panic. They didn't aim for body counts, they aimed for fractures. A line doesn't break because too many die, it breaks because too many believe it will break. And then, this is the moment that became folklore. Someone walked out of the fog alone, a figure with relaxed posture, coat dark, hands loose, as if strolling to market. Enemy muskets fired. The figure did not fall. He kept walking. I could not see clearly. The fog swallowed detail, but I saw enough. Men stepping back, faces pale, mouths opening as if to shout, and finding no voice. One man dropped his weapon and ran, then another, and then the herd moved. Fear is a herd animal. Our line surged, not because we were suddenly braver, but because the enemy's mind had already surrendered. That is what Kharakternyky did in battle. They didn't just kill men, they killed the enemy's confidence in reality.
After the fight, I expected celebration. Instead, I saw exhaustion. The Kharakternyky gathered away from the firelight. Their faces were not joyful. They looked like men who had carried something heavy and set it down only briefly. I asked one later, an elder named Hrits, why they rarely laughed. He stared at me a long time, then said, "Because laughter is how you admit you're human." "And you aren't?" I asked before I could stop myself. He touched the scar along his jaw, a line that looked like a closed eye. "We are," he said softly. "That is the problem. We must become more than human during the fight, and then we must return. Not everyone returns." That was the first time I understood the real cost. A myth is armor, but armor rubs, it bruises, it changes how you move. If you spend years convincing yourself you cannot die, you may survive the battle, yet lose something else: softness, tenderness, the ability to rest. War doesn't only injure bodies, it rewires minds. The Kharakternyky were specialists in fear. That made them powerful. It also made them haunted. The initiation that followed that battle was my own. I had watched too much. I had heard too much. Secrets have a way of pulling you inward until you either belong to them or they destroy you. Hrits led me out into reeds, no torches, only starlight and the sound of water breathing against mud. He placed an icon in my hands, then a knife. He said, "If you join us, your life becomes two lives, the life others see and the life you hide. Most men cannot hold that split. They either boast or they rot from secrecy." "How do you hold it?" I asked. He took my wrist and found my pulse with 2 fingers. "By remembering what you are," he said, "and choosing what you will be." Then he taught me the breath pattern. He taught me the code phrase. He taught me a ritual that looked like superstition and functioned like conditioning, a knot tied in a cord while repeating a psalm. The psalm was not magic, it was rhythm, a way to steady the mind. At midnight, he left me alone, no task except endurance. Wind moaned through reeds like a voice trying to become words. My thoughts became animals. They prowled, they hissed, they tried to escape. This is the moment every man learns something he cannot unlearn. Fear doesn't arrive like an enemy. It arrives like your own mind, offering you images, scenarios, regrets, humiliations. If you fight fear directly, you lose energy. If you observe it, it weakens. By dawn, my legs were numb, my hands shook, but my mind had become oddly quiet, like a lake after a storm. Hrits returned, nodded once, and said, "Good, you're empty enough to be useful." Not flattering, true.
I thought I understood them then. Then came the raid into the south, one of those strikes that later became a song. Those songs always leave out the worst parts. We moved fast, light, sleeping little. Scouts ranged ahead. The Kharakternyky were always slightly ahead of the main force, like the tip of a spear. They tested ground, listened to villages, read tracks. They moved like men reading a book written in grass. We approached an enemy outpost near a crossing, guarded, alert, confident. The Kharakternyky did not storm it. They dismantled it. They watched for 2 days and learned the outpost's psychology. Which guard felt important, which guard felt neglected, which guard complained, which guard prayed nervously. They exploited that. One night, a Kharakternyky slipped close enough to the outer fire and tossed a small object into the shadows, a charm made from bone and cord. Harmless. But the next day, one of the guards found it. Superstitious men don't need proof. They need permission to be afraid. The guard showed it to others. They argued. They watched the dark more. They slept less. By the second night, the outpost was exhausted. That's when the Kharakternyky struck, not with swords at first, but with the collapse of attention. A dog was silenced, a rope cut, a lantern extinguished. Then, inside the perimeter, a quiet voice spoke a prayer in the darkness, orthodox words, familiar enough to confuse. Guards froze. Who is praying, friend or foe? That half-second of hesitation was the opening. Steel flashed briefly, fire went out, men fell, orders died in throats. Within minutes, the outpost was ours, not because we were stronger, but because we had engineered the enemy into weakness. A Kharakternyky leaned near me afterward and whispered, "The best kill is the one you do before the blade touches." Some say Kharakternyky could transform into animals. Here is what I saw. I saw men move like wolves. Not metaphorically, practically. They hunted in silence, spread out, communicating without speech. They circled targets, they tested reactions, they waited for the right moment. I saw men vanish in fog, not by sorcery, but by understanding how the eye works, how the brain fills gaps, how darkness erases outlines. I saw telepathy that was really shared rhythm and drilled signals, a slight whistle that meant move left, a tap that meant hold, a phrase in prayer cadence that meant enemy near. Yet I also saw moments that made my rational mind sweat. A Kharakternyky could look at a village elder and know, somehow, which words would make the elder talk. He could speak softly and make a hardened man cry. He could stand in the midst of chaos and radiate calm like heat. That is not magic. That is mastery of the human nervous system. But mastery looks supernatural to those who don't have it. So the myth persisted. And the Kharakternyky, clever as they were, fed it. Not with lies, exactly, with selective truth. They allowed enemies to believe what enemies already feared, because fear is cheaper than ammunition.
By the time we returned north, stories were ahead of us. Enemies spoke of men who could not be killed. Traders spoke of raids where no alarms were raised until everything was burning. Captives spoke of calm-eyed warriors who whispered prayers as they fought, as if violence were liturgy. The word Kharakternyky shifted in meaning, as all powerful words do. Once it had implied something dark, a sorcerer, a curse. Now it became something aspirational, a protector, a master of self, a man whose character was stronger than his death. The Sich loved such symbols. Every culture does. Symbols give shape to chaos. But I knew the truth beneath the symbol. These men were not invulnerable. They were simply trained to behave as if they were, and that behavior changed battlefields. There is a psychological law as old as war. Confidence is contagious. Panic is contagious. The Kharakternyky spread confidence among allies and panic among enemies, the way plague spreads through a crowd. Their greatest weapon was not the saber. It was the calm. Calm that made an enemy doubt. Calm that made a friend stand firm. Calm that made a raid feel like fate. The last time I saw Khritz, the elder who initiated me, he was sitting alone outside the firelight, not because he was excluded, but because he preferred darkness. Darkness is quiet. Quiet is honest. I asked him, finally, the question that had gnawed at me since the riverbank execution. "Are you truly what they say?" I asked. "Do bullets truly avoid you?" He smiled the same tired smile I had seen on the prisoner. "Bullets don't avoid me," he said. "Men avoid aiming well when they're afraid." "That's it?" I demanded, almost angry. Angry because part of me wanted the world to be enchanted. Enchantment is easier than responsibility. Khritz tapped my chest with 2 fingers. "Here," he said, This is where battles are decided first. A man who can control this can control much. Then he leaned close enough that I smelled smoke and bitter herbs. But listen, he added, softer. Sometimes luck loves the disciplined. Sometimes God favors the prepared. And sometimes the world is stranger than your books. He stood and walked away into darkness as if he belonged there. And in that moment, I understood the final truth of the Kharakternyky, the one I now write for you. They were terrifying not because they were magical, but because they were what humans become when will, discipline, ritual, and ruthless intelligence fuse into one. They were special forces shaped by the steppe, masters of stealth, morale, deception, and the manipulation of fear. And they were feared because they left enemies with the worst wound of all, not a cut on the skin, but the realization that reality itself could be used against them. That is why men fled when they heard the word. That is why mothers crossed themselves and whispered it like protection. That is why even now, centuries later, the myth still walks through Ukrainian folklore like a shadow that refuses to die. Because somewhere deep in the human mind, we all recognize the most frightening kind of warrior. Not the one who screams, not the one who hates, but the one who looks at death with calm eyes and doesn't blink.